Hello there, and welcome back to War Thunder aboard the IJN Fuso, and I have in this review quite a few things to cover. First of all, I can happily tell you that the Fuso is quite the different ship to the Hyuga, which at first glance looks similar when it especially comes to the main battery firepower, but there are quite a lot of differences, and they make this ship oh so much better. Obviously, I have all the stats for you, which are updated, and a big thank you to Dario for helping me out acquiring the latest data. And just a few things more. First of all, obviously, in this review, I have a 5-minute guide from Drachinifel included, and just to appreciate the scaling that Gaijin actually does well, look at this guy. He's so small, and if you click on him, you can also look at the ship in the hangar, and oh boy, she is long, she is large, she is Fuso. And yeah, this pagoda mast is also big. Now you could run around all day long, appreciating it. Also this pirate ship that was, I think, from 2016. Doesn't really matter. So I hope you enjoyed the intro, and I hope you enjoyed the 5-minute guide. And after this, we'll see each other back in the port and just have a look at the armor and all the fine, gritty little details and the stats. I hope you enjoy.
By the time the Kawachi class had been completed, the major navies of the time had moved on to the so-called super dreadnoughts with 13.5 and 14-inch guns, and some designs were even being ordered with 15-inch guns. So the Japanese Navy was faced with a choice. They could not build another class with 12-inch guns because it would be much weaker than contemporary ships. They'd just ordered 4 Congo-class battle cruisers, and at the last minute had changed the armament to Vickers 14-inch guns from the original 12-inch designs. So to save time and costs, they decided to use the same guns in the same twin turrets, although they had been offered options for a ship with 4 triple turrets instead. This was because it was thought that more twin turrets were better for offensive action, as you could engage more targets at the same time. It also meant that there would be a lot of common parts and skills shared between the Congo and the new Fuso class, which was useful as they were supposed to operate together. Contemporary British and German designs also used a similar principle, with 8 guns in 4 turrets for the battle cruisers and 10 guns in 5 turrets for the battleships. Because 15-inch gunships were on the way, the Japanese took this principle, but extended it to 12 guns in 6 turrets. The greater number of shells, in theory, future-proofing the ships against fighting enemies with fewer but larger weapons. The ships would be capable of 23 knots, which was faster than average for battleships of the time. This did come at something of a cost though. In exchange for the numerous guns and higher than average speed, the ship's armour belt was not capable of resisting its own guns at battle ranges, which was the general rule of thumb for most battleship designs. The ship's main battery turrets were arranged with a pair forward, a pair aft, and a pair in the centre either side of the funnel. A heavy secondary battery of 6-inch guns, some anti-aircraft guns, and 6 torpedo tubes completed the weapons loadout. The class consisted of 2 ships, the Fuso and the Yamashiro, and was complete by 1915. Unlike the ships of other navies, the Fuso class did not do much in World War I other than patrol the local seas. After the war, Yamashiro became the first Japanese battleship to successfully launch aircraft, and a year later in 1923, both ships and other parts of the Imperial Japanese Navy assisted with relief efforts in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake, which, among other things, badly damaged the hulls of a number of warships under construction. During the 1930s, along with most of the Japanese battleships, they were extensively rebuilt, with numerous changes and new machinery, the most distinctive being the so-called pagoda-style mast structure, which were needed to support a number of new fire control technologies as well as light anti-aircraft weapons. Despite all this work, they were the oldest battleships in the Imperial Japanese Navy by the time of World War II and did not see much active operational service. Although the engines had been upgraded from 23 knots to being able to do just under 25 knots, they were still not quite fast enough to keep up with the main fleet, which was tied to the fast carrier force. There was a brief flurry of excitement when the ships were sent out on an unsuccessful mission to hunt down the USS Hornet after the Doolittle raid, and then a supporting role in the attack on the Aleutian Islands. After this, both ships would become training vessels and supply ships, despite a number of plans to use them in various one-off operations that never quite came to pass, including one plan to send Yamashiro with a full load of troops to Saipan, run it aground, and use it as a fixed artillery emplacement in a manner similar to the final planned mission of the Yamato later in the war. However, as losses increased and American forces got closer and closer to Japan, they began to be brought back into active service, first to try and intercept landing forces, and then finally as part of a multi-front offensive to destroy the major American landings in the Leyte Gulf area. As part of the southern force, the Fuso and Yamashiro sailed with the heavy cruiser Megami for the Surigao Strait. Along the way, Yamashiro was damaged by air attack and American torpedo boats approached, but were driven off by the ship's secondary batteries. Later that night, the destroyer USS Melvin attacked with torpedoes, scoring 1 or 2 torpedo hits on the starboard side. Depending on whose accounts you believe, the ship either then capsized and sank in 40 minutes, or listed to starboard, broke in two and caught fire, burning heavily for over an hour. In either case, between the sinking and a huge oil fire, only 10 survivors would reach the nearby shore. This left Yamashiro as the sole surviving battleship of the Southern Force, and she was met by the fire of 8 light and heavy cruisers and the 14 and 16-inch guns of 6 battleships, plus various destroyers and other light forces. It was a battle that even both ships would have lost decisively, but Yamashiro didn't go down quietly, engaging its attackers with whichever main battery guns it could bring to bear, and trying to protect its escorts with its secondary battery firing in all directions. However, despite this valiant charge, the ship was quite clearly doomed, and it was hit repeatedly by 6, 8, 14 and 16-inch shells, plus at least 4 torpedoes. As the American ships ceased fire after one of their own destroyers was hit by other American ships in the confusion, the Yamashiro rapidly capsized and sank as the last 2 torpedoes hit home. And again, there were only 10 survivors.
So I hope you enjoyed this 5-minute guide. If you want to see the original, link in the video description down below. Back to the Fuso in War Thunder, let's have a look at the armor, and we can see something very interesting, namely that the main armor belt is 12 inches or 305mm thick of rolled cemented armor. But it is not for the entire length of the ship. In fact, the front magazines and the rear magazines go down to 229mm, which is a potential weak spot, and you should keep this in mind. Then we also have the mid belt, which is 203mm or 8 inches thick, and then where there are the secondary casemate mountings, we have overall 152mm or 6 inch of rolled cemented armor. And one tiny little detail that is important, if an HE shell splashes here, it most likely doesn't have the penetration to go through the 6 inches of cemented armor. However, the top and also the bases of the casemate mountings is only 35mm. So it splashes through there, knocks out the emplacement, and that is particularly annoying when you get HE spammed, and that leads to overall losses. Now this is the same amount of losses you have for your heavy AA and also all your 25mm mid to low range anti-aircraft weaponry. Then let's talk about the barbettes of the main turrets. They are on the outer side 305mm thick, which is nice, and the turret front is 279mm thick. That also, due to a little bit of angling, can bounce a shell here and there, but actual serious AP will go right through. The deck plating with 114mm, thanks to the angle, should ricochet also most AP, and AG doesn't have usually the pen to go through this. Then we have to talk about the deck plating, which is 35mm thick, and the inner armor plating then is 76mm all over the magazines and all over the machinery, and that is some quite nice armor deck. It's not the best out there, but it still should be able to ricochet quite a lot of shells up until the point that you turn really sharply and the angle is reduced. And there also we can see the inner parts of the barbettes, which then are much thinner, going from 140 to 102mm. Now that makes sense because there is basically the belt armor serving as spaced armor and reducing the penetration power of shells incoming, and for, obvious weight reduction purposes. Two more things to mention. First of all, we have also an icebreaker of 102mm, which is really nice because also the bulkhead for the front magazine and the rear magazine is 152mm. So if you angle the ship, which I highly recommend, then you can reduce not just the effectiveness of your belt armor, but also the front armor and prevent getting citadeled. And one final thing to note here is that this looks really weird. If you look at the rear armor, there is no mid-belt section, and the quote-unquote turtleback is exposed with only 32mm. But as we could see previously, you still then have some 67mm of armor where it really matters. So that is the armor of the ship. Let's talk about the interior, and you can see that the magazines are right at the waterline for all 6 magazines. Only the most rear turret and not even the front turret are right at the waterline, so only the most rear magazine is a bit safer. All the other magazines are just a few centimeters actually above the waterline, still below the main armor deck, but this is not deep buried down below like some other ships' magazines. And so this is a tanky ship, but you shouldn't overdo it, especially versus the really big hard-hitting boys. Let's start the comparison to the IJN Hyuga and some other battleships of other nations with some general things. First of all, you do not have torpedoes, so that's the first big difference to the IJN Hyuga. But let's be honest, torpedoes of those times are not really that amazing, so they wouldn't be that useful, especially since all the ships here have them in fixed mountings, fixed tubes, and so their usefulness is to be doubted. And if something comes that close that those torpedoes would become viable, you have done a few terrible mistakes at the start. It is also the second heaviest ship in this comparison. Only HMS Hood is quite a bit heavier, and we also have a little bit of a speed advantage over, for example, the IJN Hyuga with a speed of 46 kilometers per hour, but we are still rather on the slow side, not just compared to the HMS Hood, but also most other cruisers out there. However, we have quite by a bit the highest crew amount, so we can take some losses, and that is, I guess, when you especially compare it to the IJN Hyuga down to the many AA mounts. Now let's start with the very interesting part, and that is the main battery firepower of the IJN Fuso in its 1944 configuration. We can see that we have basically the same guns as the IJN Hyuga with 12 356mm or 36 cm/ 45 Type 41 guns. 1080 rounds in total with a 30-second reload gives us an effective DPM of 24 rounds in the air every minute. Only the Patrizkaya Komuna has a touch more, but we are very comfortable in the top region here, especially since they are high caliber guns. Another difference to the IJN Hyuga is that the Fuso has less but bigger secondaries and they have the same reload. So we have 16 150mm 15cm/50 Type 41 cannons with an overall ammunition amount of 2400 rounds. Reload is 6 seconds, so we have a DPM or effective shells in the air on one broadside, where you have 8 available, of 80 shells per minute, which is quite a bit, but not quite as much as the IJN Cougar or HMS Hood, but that has significantly lower caliber. Now let's talk about what the main batteries actually deliver to the enemy. Let's talk about the ammunition. We start with the stock round, the 356mm ordinary SAP. This is the shell that used to terrorize not just destroyers and cruisers but also other battleships, and it is mentioned here as special shell in the comparison way to the left. It is the only shell that it has in common with the Cougar, and it's still, when it hits the right spot, a terrifyingly potent shell. It still has just under 69 kilograms of TNT equivalent bursting charge, which is huge, and it's relatively slow with 780 meters per second muzzle velocity, and it has 301 millimeters of penetration at 1000 meters and at 10 kilometers just below 200. So that means it no longer does ruffle stomp regardless of what the enemy feels as armor, the enemy ship. Now it needs to actually penetrate, but it also doesn't really double function as HE anymore, in the sense that if you hit the superstructure it blows up and does damage. So this shell has lost lots of its terror potential and has been brought into line, and that also makes a lot of other battleships in theory suffer. I still have to check out Hood, Bayern and other battleships that lack HE, and we will talk about just in a moment why that also makes the Arizona so much more interesting. But let's continue with some other shell types. The tier 1 upgrade is the 356mm Type 91 APC or APCBC round, and it's very interesting to look in this in a comparison to the IJN Cougar's AP round, because it seems like that we have a modernized shell that has more penetration in exchange for TNT yield. 635mm at a kilometer distance and 431mm of penetration at 10 kilometers distance are really good. However, the TNT yield of 12.2 is not just lower than the Cougar, but also the Patritskaya Kommuna's 12-inch AP round. And so the shell is really punchy, you have a lot of DPM, but you lack the damage effect, especially to the 15-inch armed ships like the HMS Hood and the SMS Bayern, but they have also lower DPM. So overall, this shell is good enough to do in a full salvo enough damage to an enemy ship. If it's bow in or if it is broadside in or angling, most of the time it doesn't matter, you do damage. Especially since the SEP round is not really that good anymore, this shell should be taken into account. The third and last shell type is the tier 2 upgrade, the 356mm Common Type 0 HE shell. And this is a shell type that the Cougar outright doesn't have. It had it at the very start, I think, but now it doesn't have it. And it's not the most potent HE shell if you compare it to other ships such as the Arizona, Marlborough and Patritskaya Komuna, but it still has it, and since you are firing 12 shells at the enemy, they do a lot of damage, cause fires, floodings, and also farm all the superstructure with the crew associated to the AA platforms. 67mm of penetration at any distance, at any angle, coming from 32.45 kilograms of TNT equivalent yield, and we have a muzzle velocity of 805 meters per second. So not the best HE shell, but definitely better than nothing. And to be honest, the Cougar would have really liked to have this shell, or to continue to have such a shell. As for the secondaries, we have the stock 152mm Type 0 HE, and that is a shell type that the Cougar secondaries don't even get, and it's good versus patrol boats and some destroyers and cruisers, but also versus battleships for the superstructure. 850 meters per second muzzle velocity and 35 millimeters of penetration at any distance against any angle. And that causes fires, causes flooding, but you know, it's quote-unquote just a 6-inch or 5.9-inch shell. It's better than the ones on the SMS Bayern, but not as good as the ones on the HMS Marlborough. As a tier 1 upgrade, you get the second shell type, that is the 152mm Type 4 SAP. It shares the same muzzle velocity of 850 meters per second and has just below 3 kilograms of TNT yield. However, it has with 81mm of maximum penetration much less than the Huger's 140mm SAP, but you have a higher yield. I would use the shell especially versus US destroyers and also cruisers, not so much versus battleships. However, it is good to have the choice. However, you do not have the same amount of DPM as the Huger, and you also don't have the same amount of shell capacity, so you can actually run out of shells mid-battle. So now let's summarize the ship. It doesn't have torpedoes, but doesn't need it. It has overall decent armor, but you should angle it and should not rely on it. It has AA, but not the best in the world, and its main battery is still quite up there, especially in the new meta where SAP isn't as dangerous as it used to be in previous patches. And so with all the variety of shells it has, it is just better suited for the meta than the Huger, and that I quite like. However, you should really focus especially on those targets that are shooting you, and should prioritize on then targets that might become really dangerous to you. Load AP for anorex, load HE for superstructure and just causing fires and floods, and let your secondaries also speak. This ship still quite got it, and I absolutely love the way that it looks, that it plays. It's really satisfying, and I can absolutely recommend it. And yeah, that is basically how you also should play it. At range, avoid the brawls, and you're just doing fine with this thing. And so at the end of the day, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the 5-minute guide by Drachinifel. Again, link to the original video in the video description down below, and let me know what you think about the length of the video, the presentation format with all the stats. Again, big shout out to Dario for helping me out with the stats, and just give this video a like if you did, subscribe if you want to see more. For you it's just a couple of clicks, from me it means the world, and we'll see each other on the battlefields, in the skies and on the waves of War Thunder.